Hello and welcome to the European Resilience Initiative Center video podcast. Today our guest is Jason J. Smart, who is a correspondent in Kyiv and who works for Kyiv Post, the oldest English-speaking media in Ukraine. Welcome, Jason.
Good to see you, Sergej.
Great to see you. Thank you that you have found time for this conversation. Look, what is the mood in Ukraine now? We know that the full-scale war is going since over 2 years, the war itself since over 10 years. And despite the fact that the US Americans and Germans have allowed Ukraine to hit finally Russia's sovereign territory, even this green light is very limited. Only a few regions in Russia can be hit. So Ukraine still continues to fight with one hand tied behind their back. Do the Ukrainians believe in victory under such conditions?
I think that the Ukrainians most certainly do still believe in victory. There's still no conversations or popular idea that it's time to negotiate with Russia. That being said, I think that, obviously the attitude has changed. And you remember very well when the war first started, I should say the full-scale invasion first started, there was a surge of nationalism and patriotism. There's a feeling that Ukraine would quickly persevere and defeat the Russians and expel them. But time has passed. There's been a lot of losses, a lot of suffering, deprivations. Now there's energy outages in a lot of the country. And now there's a realization that this is a long, grinding war. It's painful. This will not be quick. This will not be fast. But Ukraine ultimately does have a lot going in its favor, despite the fact that some allies, such as the United States, such as Germany, have refused to do what is necessary to help Ukraine to win. And I think that fundamentally comes down to the problem that the White House, for instance, has not made the decision that it wants Ukraine to win. It continues to say that it wants to help Ukraine to defend itself. And it's a very important difference. If the objective is not the defeat of Russia, but simply to assist Ukraine to carry on for a longer period of time, then the sort of assistance we can expect from the White House or the sort of steps we allow the White House to take to support Ukraine are going to be very different. And I think that's something that people in Ukraine are very sensitive to, and rightfully they're very sensitive and upset by, is that there has not been the support from Western partners to give Ukraine the aid they need and the authorizations they need to be able to succinctly defeat Russia, which is illegally occupying more than 20% of Ukraine.
Isn't it depressing for the Ukrainians to understand that their destiny depends on the calendar of elections in Europe and in the US? Like all what we hear since months and over a year is, yeah, there will be elections in Germany, there will be elections in Europe, there will be elections in France, UK, in the United States, but we cannot plan our war depending on the elections calendar. We are democracies. Every country has elections pretty regularly.
Yeah, absolutely. And it is, of course, very frustrating. And it's very hard to explain. And like yourself, I do a lot of television shows in Ukraine. And it's probably one of the top questions I get is how are we supposed to plan for our future and our victory if everything's going to depend ultimately what's going on domestically in the United States? That has nothing to do with Ukraine. It's not a preoccupation of the White House of what's best for Ukraine. It's rather a preoccupation of what is best to help win elections. And we see for 6 months, the Congress refused to pass aid for Ukraine, no matter how desperate it was. And that was due to domestic concerns in the United States. Unfortunately, that has a negative impact on Ukraine. And it's very hard to explain to people. I mean, it is. What can you say? Yes, people are going to die in Ukraine because American leaders are more concerned with what's going to happen for their reelection campaigns. And that's a fact. So ultimately, it's hard to acknowledge, it's hard to accept, but it is the reality of the situation. All foreign policy, as you well enough know, is dictated always by domestic concerns. International policy is nothing more but a reflection of what the domestic audience wants, and the politician is usually reacting to that rather than leading that. So I think that in the case of Ukraine, though, we can only hope that the Republicans at this point realize they've made a horrible mistake by not sending aid for so long, and will be more willing now to send aid in order to make a point that they are the party that's strong, that want to stand up to Putin, and that it's Biden who's been too soft. So there's the only sort of silver lining, is that there is the chance that Republicans will try to take advantages for their electoral reasons and try to outperform Biden, as they have recently said in Congress during hearings. Why is it that we've tied a hand behind Ukraine's back? Why can they not strike targets within Russia? And it's a very legitimate question, and I hope that they do continue to press on that issue.
But there is one country where elections don't play such a significant role because there is no such thing as free elections there, and this country is Russia. And the Russian army is continuing to fight in Ukraine and even tried to start a new offensive in Kharkiv region. And Russian army has lost, according to Ukrainian statistics, over 500,000 people already. What is the reason? Why do Russians continue to come to Ukraine to die? We know that some Russian soldiers, they don't last on the front line longer than 2-3 weeks, and still there is a lot of enthusiasm in Russia about this war. What is the reason for that?
As we know very well, Russia is paying people a substantial amount of money for the Russian economy to come join the military. At this point, they've expanded, now attracting people from Africa, for instance, and students, African students in Russia, to come and join the Russian military. And it's sort of incredible when you do look at the numbers. In the case of Bakhmut, for instance, it's estimated that the Wagner Group lost over 90% of the soldiers it sent there. And it's just phenomenal, the losses that Russia is taking and the total lack of concern they have for their own people. At the same time, there is a positive to this, which is that Russia does have the capacity to absorb very large losses, obviously, as they've done historically in war. That being said, they're not making really any progress. Even with those massive losses, they are not making progress. And it is truly incredible when you consider the case of Bakhmut, which was a town of 32,000 people before the war. Real population during the battle was minimal, almost non-existent. And that cost Russia more than 40,000 lives to take. So if you, it's loss numbers are numbers that are just, I can't recall a number of time in history where you've seen such a large country as Russia just not have the capacity, not the ability, despite having many more people than Ukraine, it doesn't have the ability to take more terrain. And keep in mind, Ukraine was running out of ammo during the entire past 6 months. So the fact that they were able to, even with that, to keep the Russians somewhat contained and from expanding further is by itself incredible. Russia has significant internal structural problems that I think will pose more of a threat to it in the coming months, especially economically. Russia's situation is perilous, to say the best. And it's something that pressure, I think, is actually on Putin's mind. Though he might not care at all about his people, like all dictators, I think he is very concerned with his own well-being, first and foremost, well ahead of what's the well-being of his people or Russia. It's what is good for Vladimir Putin. And I think that if he sees that there's going to be increasing economic instability in the country, he could fear that that would be something that could topple his regime, which to him is far more important than even Ukraine.
You have touched a number of very important things which we need to discuss deeper to understand what is behind this Russian behavior and how can we influence Russia the way that they stop fighting this war and retreat from Ukrainian territory. But before we do this, don't forget to like, to share, to subscribe to this channel. And if you have some friend of you in mind who you think needs to watch this interview, feel free to share it. We're talking to Jason J. Smart, who is a correspondent at Kyiv Post newspaper, the oldest English-speaking newspaper in Ukraine. And Jason, you have already mentioned this thing that Russia can absorb a lot of losses. And you have already mentioned this fact that still Russia tries to somehow export this burden and tries to involve a lot of foreigners, and those foreigners who are less protected, who are mostly vulnerable. And these are, for example, students from African countries who come to Russia, and then they get a visit from a police officer who says, okay, you are illegal now in Russia, we can deport you, but you have a choice. You can join the army, fight several months for Russia, and then you get your residence permit. But that sounds so colonial for me, and so World War I, if not earlier, that are practically forced conscription. Is it what Russia is doing?
Absolutely. I mean, I think Russia, colonial is absolutely the right word. But even you look at the domestic audience, I mean, look at, for instance, Buryatia, over 9% of males between 18 and 49 in Buryatia have done military service during the course of the war against Ukraine. Now, comparison, St. Petersburg and Moscow, it's about 0.2%. So the statistics are pretty stunning. And if you look at the casualty rates for minority districts, it's absolutely, it's incredible. I mean, if I remember the number correctly, it's well over 20 times more likely somebody who's taken to the military that from Buryatia will die in the war versus somebody that joins the military from Moscow. There is a selected decision to send people who are especially ethnic minorities and religious minorities to the front. They're considered to be more dispensable, less of a loss if they die. And the use of the students within their own country is also phenomenal. And it's a phenomenal if you look at the propaganda that Russia promotes in Africa, that, Russia is an ally of theirs and it's working with them fighting against colonialism. The great irony is that Russia does, help African students with scholarships to go study in Russia, but they also turn them into pure cannon fodder. And that shows you really what lies at the heart of Russia's generosity towards Africans.
And that is exactly what we have observed at a military factory in Tatarstan, close to Kazan, where foreign students, mostly females, were used as cheap labor force to assemble Russia's drones. And that is an absolutely evil cooperation. Like Russia cooperates with Iran, with the regime which oppresses their own people and kills their own women and men, to buy drones. And these drones are partly being assembled in Russia by forced labor force, which are the students from African countries. And this is all to kill Ukrainians. That sounds absolutely insane. But why is it absolutely not a topic in the countries from where the students are being used by Russia as either cheap labor force or forced conscripts?
No, that's an excellent question. And I think that it is, once again, it's amazing to me the influence that Russia has had in a lot of countries, developing countries, especially in Latin America as well as in Africa, where you see that there is a huge segment of the population that has sympathies for Russia. And there's a lot of reasons for that. One is just the historic reason that Russia, or I should say Soviet Union, invested very, very heavily in building different narratives over the course of the last 80 years. And that was followed by Russia, which was able to take advantage of those long-held beliefs and feelings. And I think that there's a secondary factor, which is Russia Today and other propaganda channels, but I cite Russia Today as probably one of the most impressive ones, RT, is the actual quality of the propaganda is very, very high. If you actually watch RT, for instance, in Spanish, the production level is very high. It looks very impressive. It looks very beautiful. Objectively, it looks like, a top tier television channel in Europe or in the United States. It doesn't look like it's some sort of cruddy backwater sort of thing. No, it looks very serious. And I think that adds legitimacy to what they're saying, compared to what a lot of local television stations look like in Latin America or in Africa. It is by far better quality, and that adds credibility. And they have people that are impressive. They have interesting things that they discuss. And it's far more advanced than I think many local television stations would be in a lot of countries, or radio stations. And that allows them to get their message to more people, which is, once again, essentially disinforming those people and leading them to believe a fantasy about what Russia really is about and what Russia is doing. In fact, Russia, to the contrary of everything they say, is simply exploitive of its partners in Africa. And I can think of no actual benefit it provides them that is not actually, in fact, just the benefit of the Kremlin.
Absolutely. And this moment which you have mentioned, that Russia uses these historical ties between the Soviet Union and some countries in Africa or Asia or Latin America, and saying, look, we have built you that and that, we have helped you a lot. I have a good friend of mine who is Ukrainian, and she said when she visits these countries and she hears that argument, she always says, no, it wasn't the Russians. It was my father, who was a Ukrainian, who was a Soviet engineer, who went abroad to build power plants or dams or schools, because the Soviet Union used all the power of Ukrainian workforce to send them also abroad and to do these things for the Soviet propaganda. It was not only Russians who did it. Was all the Soviet Union, a lot of Tajiks, Georgians, Armenians, Ukrainians, and other nations. But now, of course, Russia tries to privatize practically all good things which are existing in minds of other people, like, for example, victory over the German Nazism, but doesn't want to have anything in common with the crimes of the Soviet Union, like, for example, cooperation with the German Nazism between 1939 until 1941. But another aspect which I wanted to address here is the strikes by the Ukrainian army against the Russian territory. We have seen a lot of strikes with US-provided HIMARS recently, within the last week. We have also seen the first strike by a Ukrainian warplane against a targeted command point in the Belgorod Oblast. And we have seen recently very successful Ukrainian strikes with ATACMS missiles against targets in Crimea. And for the first time in history, Russian Sukhoi 57 jet has been destroyed or at least severely damaged at a military base in Akhtubinsk in southern Russia. What does it say about the dynamic of this war? Can Ukrainians finally hit the targets which endanger them?
I think that dynamic is exactly the right word. It is quite dynamic, the situation, and it's changing. Incredibly enough, though, Russia has a massive number of airplanes and helicopters, mostly left over from the Soviet Union, but still just in a massive quantity. It has not proven really to be as successful as they might have hoped. And now that we have the ability of Ukraine to fire on targets within Russia, I think things are becoming more and more challenging for the Russians. You know, historically, as everyone well enough knows, one of the problems that Ukraine has had is simply that they receive intelligence, including from the United States, satellite intelligence and signal intelligence, that indicates that Russia is, for instance, coalescing right across the border near Belgorod, Russia, and that they are in the short order going to make their way across, or that they are going to be sending more missiles across or more ammunitions across into Ukraine, and perhaps to an area that's further away. Let's imagine Lugansk, which is harder for Ukraine to reach. But Ukraine has historically not been able to strike those targets due to the restrictions put on them by the United States and the Europeans. But now, if Ukraine is able to strike those things, strike those depots as they're on the move, or strike soldiers, Russian soldiers, before they enter Ukrainian territory, this gives Ukraine a huge advantage. Ukraine can finally now prevent the Russians from being able to build up the critical mass they need to do serious offensives. Russia's offensive that began towards Kharkiv about a month ago is petering out. As you've seen the news headlines, Russia is having more and more problems. They have not been able to advance nearly as they'd hoped. They'd had suffered huge losses to do what they've done so far, and they're just not making it ahead. Russia took over some small villages with virtually no population, but after that, nothing else happened. So I think at this point, Ukraine is in a much better situation. And going forward, I think that Ukraine is going to be even better situation when you consider the efficiency of the weapons that the Americans have given to Ukraine. If you compare something such as the HIMARS or ATACMS to what the Russians are using, it's night and day. I mean, the fact is that the Americans have been able to give some of the best technology in the world to Ukraine, and that will continue to wreak havoc on the Russian military. And they have no response. There's nothing easy that Russia could do to pick up at this point. I mean, they might have a lot of things, a lot of airplanes, or a lot of soldiers, but they're inefficient. They're unable to achieve the same sort of results that Ukraine can. And that's why I think that Russia is in a far worse position than what a lot of people appreciate.
And what does it say about the military capacity of Russia to go further into this war? There are like different assessments for how long does Russia have enough equipment to continue this war. The Soviet Union has produced a lot of tanks and BMPs, and Russia also has a hope that the allies like China or North Korea will supply Russia with some additional ammunition, or even tanks or BMPs for its war. But still, these resources are not endless. So, what does it say about the ability of Russia to fight further? If, let me say, Ukrainians continue to strike one Russian oil refinery after another, and one Russian, let me say, air defense radar after another.
I think there's really three different factors we should look at. One is the fact that Russia, yes, its oil industry is being attacked by Ukraine. Fortunately, about 20% of the capacity of Russia to produce oil at this point has been destroyed. That's a very good thing. Now, at the same time, I think there's another factor that's very important to show how terribly inefficient the Russian military is and how out of control the situation really is for Russia. So let's consider, since the beginning of the war, Russia has lost more than 60% of the soldiers that it sent in were either casualties, killed or injured. 68% of the tanks sent in have been destroyed. Look at the other numbers. Russia is just facing monumental losses. It's burning through a huge amount of its arsenal. And what did that cost? So if you look at the U.S. contribution alone, just because it is the largest by far of military contribution, that equates to less than 5% of the US military budget per year. So less than 5% of the Pentagon budget per year has been able to essentially destroy the Russian military. The Russian military will not be able to rebuild, even if it started today. It would take more than a decade to get back to where it was to pre-2022 levels. The US, on a very, very cheap cost, has been able to completely deprive Russia of having a military that can even compete with its neighbors. Russia now is in a very dangerous position. If it were to be put into another conflict in the immediate future, immediately while this war in Ukraine is happening, or if after it concludes, Russia would have a very difficult time to defend itself simply because it's burnt through so much of what it had. But another factor I think is very important is that what's going on domestically in Russia. A lot of the people, I think incorrectly, cite the statistics that Russia is increasing so much the spending on the military. As you know, the estimates that have come out before the war was about 1/3 of the money sent to the military of Russia was being embezzled. So if you lose about 1/3 of it to being stolen, it's a significant loss. But another significant loss is inflation. This year's inflation, current inflation, is estimated about 24%. So that means another quarter of the money that Russian military is getting is sort of being eaten up by the inflation. But if we look at the other details, Russia isn't committing all of its military to the war in Ukraine. They have a lot of soldiers in other places, specifically in the Caucasus region, but they also keep a lot of soldiers near the capital and major cities in order to put down insurrection should they rise. So Russia is actually it's got very, very large obligations economically to their military throughout the country. So no matter how much you're spending, it's not nearly as impressive as a number as many people think. Yes, it's much more than Ukraine, but when you factor in what that means in real terms, it's much less. So that gives me actually a lot of hope. The other thing that I think is very important is that we see that there's a secondary indicators that Russia's economy is about to get far worse. We see that the unemployment level is about 2% or so. That's not normal. So in a country like Russia, your unemployment rate that you'd want to have, the ideal unemployment rate, is probably about 5%, more or less. When you have about 2%, that's actually indicative of high inflation. So when you have full employment, that means that you're paying everybody and there's a lot more going in than it should be. Russia's burned through a lot of their foreign currency reserves. We see that their ability then to balance the ruble going forward is going to become more challenging. And their key interest rate is 17%. That number is suspected to be going up in the near term. So when you have an interest rate, let's say they move it to 19 or 20% interest rate from the central bank, that makes lending very difficult. Lending becomes difficult then for businesses. It means businesses are not able to expand, which means the tax space of Russia decreases. And they've just increased, guess what? The taxes again in Russia. So those taxes, which they've said are going to help with pensions, we know is probably false. It's going to go to the military. But the base for that is becoming more limited. And that doesn't even begin to factor in the fact that Russia's replacement level birth rate is so low. Russia doesn't have enough children by any means, especially those, if Putin is worried about the ethnic Russians, which I suspect is his real concern when he says that Russians should have more kids. He doesn't mean the Kyrgyz. He doesn't mean the Chechens. I think he has very well in mind ethnic Russians. Those are the ones that are dying out at the fastest rate. There's simply not replacement, which means that paying pensions in the future or keeping the Social Security in Russia operating is going to become more and more challenging. And instead of investing money that could try to improve that, Putin has just thrown buckets and buckets of new money at the military, which his friends, such as Shoigu, has spent years and years lapping up and eating through his corrupt schemes.
Well, that is, on one hand, is a good sign that they spend their money ineffectively and they lead their country into a catastrophe economically and demographically. Of course, at the same time, they kill a lot of innocent people in Ukraine, which is the worst news one can get. I'm pretty sure that most of Ukrainians would say we don't want to see like any collapse of Russian economy, etc. Just get out of our country and stop killing our friends and our relatives. But the reality is that Putin has support of elites and population, and they run this war. But they run this war, thankfully, to like on a very inefficient way, which gives us a hope. But I still can name at least one field or one battlefield on which Russia is still pretty effective, and that is propaganda battlefield, and mostly in Europe, abroad. And that is what is happening right now. For example, in Germany, we had elections for the European Parliament recently. And you know what? In certain regions of Germany, pro-Russian far right and far left parties all combined got over 50% of votes. And that's a very bad sign. So is it Putin's goal to undermine our ability to fight him through infiltrating our political system?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, Russia does invest incredible amounts of money to try to manipulate what is going on in the West. And I think it's a very wise investment, to be frank. It's unfortunate that the West is so hesitant to follow that model and trying to influence what happens in Russia. It should definitely be doing more of that. The fact is that Russia is directly and indirectly helping political forces in the West that would seek to have support for Ukraine decrease, or would seek to have some sort of a peace agreement now with Russia. And we see in social media, I think that's probably one of the easiest ones to spot, is if you look at Twitter, especially since 2022, and I think anyone that uses Twitter would notice it with their own eyes, the degree that there is Russian bots and trolls is just out of control. The numbers are just, it's incredible how fast it's growing. Just in the past few days, somebody who's wanted for treason in Ukraine, who formerly worked with Viktor Medvedchuk, whose godfather of his kid happens to be Vladimir Putin. But guess what? This former television host from Ukraine that is now fled, is now living in Dubai, puts out Russian propaganda every day. Videos that are put online get more than 1 million clicks in less than 16 hours. It's very hard to believe that's all organic, but neither here nor there. In the course of a week, nobody had ever heard of them in English before. They gained 28,000 followers on Twitter. And now it seems very strange, very improbable that was all organically done and it just grew naturally. Much more likely is that there's heavy money behind that. But given the fact that Twitter has decided to do away with the checks and balances that it had, it did have means before of detecting that. It did have an active program to try to root that out. And they've done away with that. As a result, Russia is going to use that to try to influence what's going on in the elections in other countries, including the United States. And it's something that I think that is well worthy of investigation at the federal level in Germany or in the UK or in the United States, because it's something that is going to have a direct impact on all the citizens of those countries.
Absolutely. But before we go further and address this particular topic of Russian intelligence networks in our countries, don't forget to like, to share, subscribe to this channel, or if you know anyone who you think needs to listen to this interview, feel free to share this link with this person. We are talking with Jason J. Smart, who is a correspondent at Kyiv Post, the oldest English-speaking media in Ukraine, who spent years and years in Ukraine, who is fluent in both Ukrainian and Russian. I had a chance to listen to him in both of those languages, and who is a real expert in Ukrainian domestic policy and in Russian domestic politics, and in how Russian elites think and what are their goals in this war. Jason, we have already addressed this issue of Russian sabotage and espionage and influence networks in Europe and in the US. And we have seen recently in Europe several situations when we could say, well, it went way too far. We have seen recently attacks in Poland, which were attributed to Russia. We have seen statements by Czech authorities that Russian agencies planned arsonist attacks in Czechia. And we have seen in Germany things which really look scary, like, for example, the cache of explosives and fuses found close to a oil pipeline next to a NATO military base in Heidelberg. Do the Russians act in our own house like at their own house?
Yeah, I think that's one thing that the West has been so slow to pick up on, is the fact that Russia, or in the eyes of Putin, I should say, there's already an active war occurring with the West. I mean, there's already war. I don't know why we worry so much about these red lines. In the eyes of Putin, there is already a war. And that's why when we see these things such as terrorism, and just last week, in France, as an example, the explosion that occurred there, the degree that Russia is somehow tied to actual terrorism, I mean, in the streets, blowing things up, attacking facilities. This is incredible. This is actually incredible. There's actual sabotage going on. There's assassination of people regularly in the West. There's attacks on Western institutions. And then you go to cyberspace, and it's exactly the same. Russia's actively attacking government infrastructure. It's attacking private infrastructure. It's causing billions of dollars of losses per year. And everyone sits around and goes, but we don't want to escalate the situation with Russia. They might react. I don't know what sort of reaction we expect at this point because they are already engaged in warfare against us. And so we should really wake up to this fact and understand that Russia is a nefarious nation, that Putin himself is a threat and is the enemy of the West. I mean, today he declared the United States an enemy of Russia, or I should say the Russian government did, not he himself. And so what we have going forward is going to be more and more struggles. And if we do not address it now, that is, if we do not take active measures at this point to defeat Russia and to defeat the Putin regime, we're just going to have more and more assassinations, killings, explosions, hackings going on against the West and against our interests. And our leaders, I don't know if it's so naive or they're just too focused on the elections, look past this and they choose not to look the problem in the eyes and to address it, but instead hope that it'll just somehow magically go away.
But that is what I think no person who understands how Russians think can accept and understand. Like, what do our leaders expect? That we ignore the fact that the Russians operate in our streets and kill people in our streets and try to destroy our property? And if we pretend we have not seen that, what do they expect? The Russians will stop doing that? Quite the opposite. They will do more because they know they can do it without any consequence.
Absolutely. I mean, Russia is a country that probably out of all the countries is probably the most well known for doing something that it knows to be illegal or that might cause problems. And when it sees that there's not a sufficient reaction to it, we'll just do more and more of it. It picks up. It doesn't just stop ever. Ever. And what's incredible is, I think, the degree that Russia is engaged in the larger problems that we face in the West. It's not limited to Ukraine. And that's why I always try to take, the Russia outside the context of Ukraine. It's very clear. You and I both lived for a long time in Ukraine. But if we look at the context, which you're well enough aware of, look at Russia's direct operations with organizations such as Hamas or Hezbollah. But then you look at its also relationship with something like drug cartels in Latin America or the other sanctioned countries such as North Korea, Nicaragua, Venezuela, Cuba. What's about all this? What's going on? Well, the fact is that Russia is the kingpin of a large international consortium, let's call it, of sanctioned organizations. Those are countries like the ones I just listed, or organizations that de facto are sanctioned in that they are legal. They cannot legally do business anywhere, such as the drug cartels, such as the terrorist organizations. And Russia openly works with them because it knows that it puts a challenge, it puts pressure on the West. If you look at the illegal immigration that's entering the United States now, illegal immigration is the top issue in all polling in the United States. It's what Americans are the most concerned by. And every year before we have elections, there's somehow a surge of illegal immigration. Well, guess what? They're going through Nicaragua. Look at the number of flights to Nicaragua from other countries in South America where people are arriving. Guess who Nicaragua deals with the most? Russia. And they're putting the pressure to send more people. And where else do we see that exact same game plan? We see it with Belarus. We see what's going on the Polish border. We saw it in 2022 before the war started. Exact same situation with Belarus, with the migrants it brought in. With the with the Polish border as well as with the Lithuanian border. We're seeing this all replay throughout the world. Russia is actively trying to undermine our countries and undermine our civilizations. And by turning our head the other way and not appreciating how grave the situation really is, we're in fact putting into jeopardy the lives of our citizens.
And that is not what only Vladimir Putin is obviously doing and planning. Like, he's a smart guy. He has managed to climb to the top of the Russian Empire, and he managed to keep his inner circle and the country under control for over 20 years. But he's not responsible for everything what Russia is doing. There should be other smart guys with criminal minds who plan all these operations and who think, okay, we'll do that, and this will bring us some results, and then we push further. What is behind this way of thinking?
It's a very good question. I think from everything I've read about Putin and his inner circle, increasingly over time, I've come to realize that it's probably true what they say about him, which is that he rarely has to give direct orders to do something that's truly evil. That's truly going to be criminal on the international level. He knows that when he has a group of people surrounding him that listen very carefully to every word he uses, they can read between the lines. So if they wish to ingratiate themselves to Putin, they might not have to go and get him to sign off on shipping migrants from North Africa to Belarus in order to make them go attack the Polish border. I think that there can be just a hint drop that, the Polish are really creating problems. Somebody should probably do something about that. And people understand that that means go ahead and go do what they've done before and go stoke up problems in the region. And people within the bureaucracy, within the FSB, they understand very well that if they want to get promoted or if they want to be looked at well, they have to come with him with results. And they take pride in the fact that they're engaged in these sort of illegal international endeavors. And I think that Putin, is sort of happy that, like the Mafia Don, he never has to actually give the order to do something. I mean, there's always been the question, did he order the killing of Nemtsov? I have no doubt that he suggested that Boris Nemtsov had become too much of a problem and Nemtsov ended up dead. But it doesn't ultimately matter if Putin ordered it. Putin would have most certainly desired that to happen and had made that clear indirectly. And so Nemtsov was killed. It's the way that Putin operates. So I think it is sort of fascinating how his criminal enterprise, which is the best way of defining it, because it's actually much more similar to a criminal enterprise than it is to a normal government, operates.
And of course, Putin also provides the country and the world with very clear signals what kind of behavior is welcome in Russia. We have seen this example during the last so-called Victory Day parade in Moscow on the 9th May, when Putin has surrounded himself with officers exactly from the military units which participated in the worst atrocities in Ukraine. One commander who is responsible for Bucha massacre, another one who was responsible for other war crimes, and they were just like picked up and put behind Putin. And on every picture which Russian TV broadcasted with Vladimir Putin standing on the Red Square, you could see, yes, like the officers who have killed Ukrainian civilians massively, they have been promoted and brought to Moscow to honor them as heroes of this genocidal war against Ukraine. So my question to you is, for many Russians, it is clear that the Russian army does evil things in Ukraine. They don't say we kill no civilians. They don't say we don't bomb like any like hospitals or residential area, etc. They know it happens. They still find excuses for that. How is it possible? And how is it possible after defeat of Russia, which will happen, I believe? How is it possible to re-educate this nation?
I think that the Russian military, there's an entire psychology that's quite a bit different than the Western militaries. It's the fact, and I go back to what I said earlier, the fact that it's thought of like a criminal organization. I think that it's known for its gratuitous use of violence, including against civilians, or its use of torture, is something it wants the world to know. I mean, if they didn't want the world to know, they could hide it. I mean, it's really not that hard. But it's like the POWs. You've seen all the videos and photographs of prisoners of war returning back to Ukraine who have clearly been starved. I mean, they've very clearly been starved for months. Russia knew that they would eventually go back. They could have fed them if they wanted to. They could have made everything look okay. There are ways to even torture people and not leave so many obvious marks. But why would they do it the way that they do? Why would they leave a scene like Bucha with bodies strewn around? It's because Russia wants that. I think that there is an actual decision that we are as bad as we wish to be. We can do what we want, and the world can't do anything about it. It's like their calling card. And I think that that is actually probably the most incredible thing. And look at the people who are wanted currently in the West for let's say assassinations, including the guy, his name escapes my mind, who killed Litvenko, the former spy. Thank you very much. Exactly. What happens? He comes back. He's wanted in the West, and he becomes a member of parliament. So that shows you a lot of how it's treated in Russia. The fact that, yes, he might very well be a killer. Everyone sort of understands it was him. I mean, I don't think that the Russians really did that much work to try to make it look like it wasn't him. But they like to rub it in the face of everybody else as, yes, so what? He killed someone in your country, and now he's a member of parliament with immunity. And what can you do about it? That's a very Russian way of approaching this.
Absolutely. And that is the enemy which has attacked Ukraine and which is still occupying a huge part of Ukraine, about 20% of the territory. And that is the enemy which would gladly attack the NATO and other countries as soon as Ukraine fails. That's why also it is in our interest to support Ukraine and to help Ukrainians to fight Russia's aggression back. Thank you so much for this interview. It was a very insightful conversation with Jason J. Smart, who is a correspondent at Kyiv Post, the oldest English-speaking media in Ukraine, and who is a great expert in Ukrainian and Russian domestic and foreign politics. Thank you very much for this interview, Jason.
Great to see you. Thank you so much.
And don't forget to like, to share, to subscribe to this channel. And if you have any person who you think is needed to watch this interview, to know more about this war and about why it's so important to support Ukraine, feel free to share this video with them and stay with Ukraine.